How authentic are the Gospels? The first 4 books of the New Testament claim to describe the birth, life, death, and even the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. But how authentic are they? Are they nothing but myth and legend, or do they contain objective historical information? Authenticity would be judged on a number of factors. Firstly, the date. Was this document written close to the events that it describes, or many years afterwards? Then the authorship. Did the author have access to first-hand information, or was he just writing down years of myth and legend? Thirdly, the copies that we have. Do we have copies from close to the original date, or copies made centuries afterwards? And how many do we have, and do they corroborate one another? And then fourthly, the accuracy of the information in them. Can we validate it against other sources? So let's look at these 4 factors in the context of the Gospels. Firstly, the date. As scholars agree that the Gospels were written very early. Mark probably 70 AD, the others a few years afterwards. What do they base that on? Well, the oldest fragment of a Gospel that we have is a piece of John's Gospel that's been dated to 120 AD, maybe even 100 AD. And that's on the basis of radioactive dating and other factors that archaeologists use. And then we have 5 fragments of different Gospels that dated with the 2nd or at latest the 3rd century. Before the 3rd century, the Greek language had no lowercase letters, so that's an easy hint as to the age of a document. Then the Gospels are quoted widely by the next generation of Christian writers. So there are at least 5 authors from 150 AD or earlier who quote verses from the Gospels. Papias of Hierapolis, Polycarp, Clement of Rome, and in the Didache, which is a small Christian book, and by Ignatius. So clearly the Gospels were written before those guys were writing. Then circumstantial hints, there's the missing content. The prophecy of Jesus about the temple, that no stone would be left upon another, which was fulfilled in 71 AD when the temple was razed by the Romans. That's a strange omission if the books were written before that event. The book of Acts, which is a sequel to the 3rd Gospel, omits the death of Paul, the main character. And again, that's an odd omission unless it was written before that happened. So all of the evidence points to the 2nd Gospel being written about 40 years after the death of Jesus. That's equivalent to somebody today writing about the Falklands War. It's in living memory. There are living witnesses to it. In comparison, the 2 earliest biographies we have of Alexander the Great were written 400 years after his life. Written 400 years after. And then the authorship. Who wrote them really? The very early church was pretty unanimous about the authorship of the Gospels. It was established quite early on and there was no real controversy about it. Irenaeus affirms the authorship of all 4 of the Gospels. Dr. Craig Bloomberg, who's professor of the New Testament at Denver Seminary, said, "The uniform testimony of the early church was that Matthew, also known as Levi the tax collector, and one of the 12 disciples, was the author of the 1st Gospel, that John Mark, a companion of Peter, wrote the 2nd, and that Luke, known as Paul's beloved physician, wrote both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles." Regarding Luke's identity, William Hobart compared the terminology used in both Luke's Gospel and the book of Acts with that used by Hippocrates and other Greek physicians. And he found that from an examination of the language employed in the 3rd Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, both are the works of a person well acquainted with the language of the Greek medical schools. So that's consistent with the tradition. And then there's the crossover with Paul's letters, which clearly identify the author as one of Paul's companions. The second Gospel, interestingly, omits a number of events that are rather unflattering to Peter, which again is consistent with him being Peter's biographer. Now, we don't know whether Peter himself left those bits out or Mark decided it was polite to do so. I like to imagine Mark's mum looking over his shoulder and saying, "You can't write that about Peter," but that's probably just my imagination. Some scholars have tried to identify primary sources from which the Gospel writers drew, and they may well have existed. In truth, none of the writers claims 100% originality for what they're writing down, quite the reverse. And of course, if those primary sources exist, they would have had to have been even closer to the life of Jesus than the Gospels themselves. Then how about copies? We have more ancient manuscripts of the New Testament than any other ancient writing. So we have 5,800 manuscripts in the original Greek, 33 from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and 5 manuscripts I've mentioned from around 150 AD or earlier. Now compare that with Julius Caesar's commentaries on his Gallic Wars, which was a set book when I had the misfortune to learn Latin at school. Of that, the oldest manuscript copies we have are from the 9th century. That's copies made 1,000 years after the events, and yet it's regarded as authentic. Accuracy, are they factual? Can we validate any of the information? Luke, in the 1st chapter, said, "I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning." Does that claim stand up? Well, as a Greek physician, Luke was uniquely qualified to do exactly that. The Greeks had strange ideas about the origins and treatments of diseases, but in terms of their powers of observation and recording, they were second to none. Their drawings, their anatomical drawings of the human body, could still be found in medical textbooks until relatively recently. And Luke's writing does show a level of accuracy and factual detail that is unusual, to say the least, in classical history. He names 30 locations, roughly, most of which can be identified by archaeology and other sources, and some of which are still around today. Of the 70 or so people that he names, 12 are Roman and Jewish dignitaries, all of whom can be validated from other ancient sources. Perhaps the best example is this one. The beginning of Luke chapter 3. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. In the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, every single thing that follows is true and can be validated from other sources. Why 2 high priests? That sounds a bit unusual. Well, Annas, the high priest, was deposed by the Romans at the age of 33, but the Jews refused to accept his deposition and continued to regard him as a high priest. So you had the official high priest appointed by the Romans and the unofficial deposed high priest Annas, who continued to exercise much influence behind the scenes. Professor Sir William Mitchell Ramsay probably spent more time studying the writings of Luke than any other person, and he described him as a historian of the first order. He said in his book, The Bearing of Recent Discovery, "You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians." Now, a lot more could be said about Luke. He is one of my heroes, such a fabulous writer, and about the other Gospels. And of course, given the degree of commonality between them, what legitimizes one legitimizes all, particularly the first 3. But I do want to just cover one other point, because it's not to say that there are not difficulties and discrepancies within the Gospels and between the Gospels. There always are in writings of this vintage. For example, of Hannibal's famous crossing of the Alps, we have two accounts written by Polybius and Livy, which are so completely different that one writer described them as irreconcilable. The thing that's unusual about the Gospels compared with other ancient writings of their era is not how many difficulties there are, but how few. And in truth, even fewer are irresolvable. In many cases, there are a number of possible explanations. We just don't have enough information to know which one is the right one. The real issue, I suspect, for most people with the Gospels is not that kind of historical information, the sociological, the human stories, but it's the miracles, the supernatural. Those are just challenging and hard to believe. But you know what? History is full of things that were hard to believe at the time, but turned out to be true. The Wright brothers' first powered flight was widely disbelieved for 4.5 years until they were able to mount simultaneous public demonstrations in North America and Europe. Reports of warm-blooded animals that laid eggs were also not accepted until the Zoological Society of London sent one of their own zoologists halfway around the world to Australia to validate them. So just because something is hard to believe and widely disbelieved, that doesn't mean it's not true. Whatever you make of the content of the Gospels, they remain some of the best attested, if not the best attested documents of their age, and as such, they deserve to be taken seriously. Have you read any of them? I mean, really read with serious intent? If not, I'd encourage you, I'd challenge you to do so. And please don't read them in some ancient version of English that nobody speaks anymore and that's hard to understand. That's not the kind of language they were written in. Read them in a recent translation like this one, the NIV. You don't have to get a fancy leatherback one, or a good paraphrase like The Message, which puts the gospel into contemporary language. That's the kind of language they were written in. They were not written in the classical Greek of the great literature. They were written in the koine, the everyday language of the street and of business and conversation. So I would encourage you, get one of those. The World English Bible is free to download. You can get it as a PDF or even as an audio file and just listen to it. Have a read. Take them seriously. They deserve it.